Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution area of study 2. In this video, we'll be looking at the economic policies that became known as war communism. The reason they're called war communism is because they were the policies that that Sovnarkom introduced in response to the pressures of the Civil War. So they run from 1918 to 1921. Now, here's a quote from the official history of the CPSU. That is the Stalin-backed and endorsed history of the Russian Revolution. So the official history of the CPSU says victory in the Civil War would have been impossible without war communism, which was necessitated by the war. So basically, without the policies of war communism, Red victory would not have happened. So the key knowledge that we're going to touch on in this video, we will look at the challenges the new regime faced in attempting to consolidate its power, including the Civil War. We're going to revisit not white terror, but we're going to revisit red terror because I feel like I didn't do it justice in the last video. We'll look at the policies of state capitalism and war communism. State capitalism we looked at in our first video on the Bolshevik consolidation of power. So this will be more of a recap to lead into war communism. We will look at the changes and continuities in political, social, cultural, and in this video, mainly economic conditions that influence leaders to compromise and or achieve their revolutionary ideals, including state capitalism and mainly war communism. We will look at the role of significant individuals that influence and change society, including Vladimir Lenin. And we, in our last video, didn't really touch on Felix Dzerzhinsky, even though he was the head of the Cheka who facilitated the Red Terror. So we'll touch a bit more on him in our recap of Red Terror, or our elaboration on Red Terror. And we'll also be looking at the diverse revolutionary experiences of social groups, with a particular focus in this video on peasants, workers, and the bourgeoisie. So let's get right into it by elaborating on the Red Terror. So this table, I've modified it slightly, but this comes from the Russian Revolution Study and Exam Guides written by Ian Lyle, which is published by the HTAV. I'd highly recommend these study and exam guides. There's one for Russia and one for China. They are fantastic for really concise information on all the key knowledge points. There is my plug for Ian Lyle's book. Let's have a look at the Red Terror. So starting with Felix Dzerzhinsky and the establishment of the Cheka, which we did look at briefly in our first video on the consolidation of power. So a challenge faced by the Bolsheviks was that they were convinced that the revolution would and was coming under attack from traitors and counter-revolutionaries. In response to that, they created the Cheka on the 7th of December 1917. Felix Dzerzhinsky was appointed director of the Cheka. He was otherwise known as Iron Felix because he ruled with an iron fist. So Iron Felix encouraged Cheka agents to view themselves as soldiers on the internal front of the Civil War. And the outcome of the Bolshevik response was that the Cheka developed into a secret police force similar to the Tsarist Okhrana, but much more brutal, as we touched on in our last video. The new regime also began to persecute critics and dissenters. They would not accept any criticism to their rule. And in terms of the Red Terror itself, there was a perception that the regime was under attack from within, and this was fueled by the establishment of a rival government in Samara initially by SR Constituent Assembly delegates in June 1918, and later after a coup d'etat by Admiral Kolchak. So already within Russia, there was a rival government that had established itself. There was an attempted coup d'etat by left SRs in July, and they briefly seized control of Moscow from the 6th to the 7th of July 1918. So the left SRs had initially been on the Bolshevik side, but within not even a year of the Bolsheviks taking power, there was an attempted coup d'etat by the left SRs. And finally, and perhaps most significantly in terms of the Bolshevik response, was the assassination attempt on Lenin on the 30th of August 1918. This was a serious attempt which left Lenin seriously injured by SR Fanya Kaplan. And so just days after the assassination attempt, when Lenin was incapacitated, is that the word? I don't know. Lenin was seriously injured and out of action for quite a while. The Sovnarkom introduced the Decree on Red Terror on the 5th of September 1918. This gave the Cheka unlimited powers to fight threats to the revolution, including mass arrests, hostage-taking, and torture used to identify enemies of the state. 140,000 suspected counter-revolutionaries were executed without trial, and 84 concentration camps were established, which could hold 50,000 prisoners at any time. They really were the soldiers on the internal front of the Civil War. And the outcome of the Decree on Red Terror, Russia was largely transformed into a police state. All dissent was silenced by 1921, or at least any dissent was dealt with harshly by Chekists by 1921. The Bolsheviks became increasingly reliant on terror to maintain their own control, and support for the Bolsheviks among workers and peasants declined. Now, this is significant since the workers in particular are the Bolsheviks' support base. So that's just an elaboration on the Red Terror. Let's now look at the policies. Well, let's start by looking at the policies of state capitalism by recapping those. So in April 1918, Lenin proposed a transitional economic approach that came to be known as state capitalism. The government would exercise tight control over key industries. They would have a monopoly on trade. The financial policy would be directed through a state-owned bank, but most businesses and industries would retain their old managers and bosses. Lenin argued that the expertise of bourgeois experts was necessary in this transitional phase of development from capitalism to socialism. The Workers' Control Decree had given industrial laborers the right to apply to the government to form self-management committees in their factories, but many workers took control of their workplaces from the bourgeois owners without official government approval. They felt that they should control their factories, and so that was sort of a challenge to state capitalism. So that's just a recap of the first economic policies introduced by Sovnarkom. Now, fast forward a few months, and state capitalism was under strain due to material shortages, pressure from workers for the nationalisation of industry, as is shown by the workers taking control of their factories, even without government approval, declining grain stock, and the pressure of the Civil War and subsequent lack of international trade. The loss of Ukraine, first through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, then through White Army occupation, then through peasant uprisings, denied European Russia its breadbasket. Ukraine had long been seen as the breadbasket of Russia. It had previously supplied 40% of Russia's food, so this led to severe food shortages. To quote Lenin, he said, "To get bread, that is the basis of socialism today." So that shows us that the policies of war communism would largely be centered around acquiring enough bread to feed the population. The Bolsheviks needed to secure food to the cities, halt economic breakdown, and focus industrial production on supplying the Red Army. So they were sort of the challenges that they faced. In response to these challenges, in the summer of 1918, a range of harsh, centralized policies were introduced, which later became known as war communism. Now, these policies are listed here to the right. So we've got nationalization of industry, militarized workplaces, forced labor for the bourgeoisie, the abolition of money. Black market trading isn't exactly a policy, but it was something that took place due to the abolition of money and due to other aspects of war communism, which we'll touch on as well. State-supplied services, the Crusade for Bread, which encompasses committees of the poor and requisition squads. So let's look into each of these policies in more detail now. Starting with the nationalization of industry. So on the 28th of June, 1918, the decree on nationalization was released. This essentially started war communism. It announced that the state would take full ownership of a number of industries, including textile, electrical, and mining industries. By November 1920, Sovnarkom had declared the nationalization of all factories that employed more than 10 workers and all factories that used powered machinery that had more than 5 workers. So basically, all factories were nationalized, or all industries were nationalized and owned by the state. This mass nationalization led to bureaucratic issues and difficulties with supply and distribution. Since previously there had been bourgeois experts who knew how to manage and how to manage these factories and how to manage industry, and now it is they are run by a central branch of the government that may not be able to take care of every single industry at once, as well as bourgeois experts and managers would be able to control their own industry and their own factories. A further obstruction to economic recovery was the lack of manpower caused by military conscription to fight for the Red Army, as well as the flight of workers from urban areas to the countryside. And we'll touch more on that very shortly. Another reason for a depleted workforce was the militarized workplaces. So due to worker shortages, workers were sent to factories where they were most needed, and those who disobeyed were threatened with loss of food rations and imprisonment. Towards the end of the Civil War, Trotsky mobilized battalions of the Red Army into labor armies that had to submit military-style reports on their progress and were marched to and from their workplaces. Longer working hours were introduced in all industries. So initially, the 8-hour workday was a big selling point for the Bolsheviks. And now, with war communism and the need for industrial output, longer working hours were reintroduced in all industries. Absenteeism was punished, and strikers were threatened with execution. As Trotsky said, a deserter from labor is as contemptible and despicable as a deserter from the battlefield. Another aspect of militarized workplaces was subotnik. So subotnik refers to voluntary, that's a big inverted commas there, voluntary weekend work, where workers would have to come in on their days off to try and boost industrial output. So people were working longer hours, they were working under harsher conditions, they were working an extra day a week, and this led to resentment among workers. However, something that didn't lead to resentment among proletariat workers was the forced labor for the bourgeoisie. So from October 1917, from October 1918, members of the bourgeoisie were forced into labor service. Trotsky is quoted as saying, "Our grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and fathers all had to clean up the shit and filth of your grandfathers and fathers. Now you are going to do the same for us." And they did. The bourgeoisie were forced into work gangs who had to shovel snow, clean rubbish, dig graves, and clean the communal toilets of government buildings. Now, it wasn't just the bourgeoisie, it was also the Russian clergy of the Orthodox Church. So you can see in this source by Ivan Vladimirov from 1919, Russian clergy on forced labor. You can also see an armed guard in this visual source. And so all bourgeois laborers were under armed guard and were often humiliated or mocked as they worked. They were known as former people, which is a big indication of the diverse revolutionary experience of some of these previously wealthier groups or higher class groups. So basically that's saying that before the October Revolution, yes, you were people, you had status in society. Now you have no place in this new society. You are former people. So they were required to register their details with the checker so their work could be monitored. And like I said, this forced labor of the bourgeoisie was widely supported by the proletariat. The abolition of money. So in 1919, Lenin declared that the Communist Party will strive as speedily as possible to introduce the most radical measures to pave the way for the abolition of money. Think about why the Communist Party might wish to abolish money. I mean, in an ideal utopian communist state, money is a symbol of capitalism. So having money seems meaningless and useless in a ideal communist state in which everything is equal and the workers control the means of production. To try and radically introduce the abolition of money, the party purposely induced hyperinflation by printing money to the point that it became worthless. The more money you print, the less value it has. So after the communist regime had eliminated reliance on a monetary economy, it aimed to become the sole producer and provider of goods and food. The decree on the abolition of trade from the 21st of November 1918 formally abolished money, made all private trade illegal, including small business, peasant markets, and selling of any personal goods for profit, and introduced payment in rations rather than in money. A government body called the Food Commissariat was the only organization allowed to supply consumer items and food. However, this ban on private trading, as well as insufficient rations, resulted in a booming black market. There was a mass shortage of food in the cities. Only 50 grams of bread per day workers were rationed. So that meant that most workers joined what was known as the bag trade, with 30% absent from work on any given day. So-called bagmen traveled by train, bartering goods in exchange for food in the countryside. And illegal markets were often the only way that city people could get enough food to survive. 50 grams of bread, while you can survive for a time on that, it is not enough food to survive and be able to work the long hours that they were demanded to work. So an example of this, or a statistic to back this up, is that in 1918 and 1919, illegal traders supplied the cities with around 60% of their bread. So that shows that the rations were insufficient to sustain the workers. The authorities occasionally raided markets and arrested people, and they released propaganda denouncing illegal traders. But consumer demand meant that markets generally reopened the next day, and the bartering system and black market had to be tolerated. So while it's not an official policy of war communism, it's something that must be mentioned because it was tolerated, at least, by the Communist Party. State-supplied services. So a range of services were provided for free to replace wages that had previously been paid in cash. The postal service was free, public transport was free, medical treatment, food rations, payments for rent and heating were abolished, and the cinema and theater were also free. In July 1918, a class-based food rationing system was introduced where workers, soldiers, and members of the Communist Party received more than the upper classes. As Lenin is quoted as saying, "He who does not work, neither shall he eat." And Zinoviev backed this up by speaking of the bourgeoisie receiving just enough bread to remember the smell of it. So these state-supplied services for workers was a positive of war communism. They received a lot for free because money had been abolished, and this was the sort of flip side of the negatives of war communism, was these state-supplied services that were provided to workers. Now, let's talk about the Crusade for Bread, starting off by looking at committees of the poor. So as I mentioned before, there were extreme bread shortages in the cities. Petrograd citizens could only purchase 50 grams of bread per day. And this led to riots and thousands of deaths due to starvation. Lenin was convinced that food shortages were due to rich peasants, otherwise known as kulaks, hoarding surplus grain. He was obsessed with this idea of kulaks hoarding surplus grain. And Sverdlov, another leading Bolshevik, said, "Only if we split the village into two camps," that being the kulaks, the rich peasants, and the regular peasants, so as to arouse there the same class war as in the cities, will we achieve in the villages what we have achieved in the cities. So they're trying to encourage class warfare in the countryside between the kulaks and the regular peasants. On the 11th of June 1918, the government announced that committees of the poor, or kombedi, were to be formed throughout the countryside to help extract grain from the rich kulaks, confiscate it, and hand it over to Soviet officials. These committees of the poor were largely unsuccessful. In some villages, the kombedi targeted middle peasants who Lenin wanted to win over. Self-interest meant that peasants often didn't hand grain over to the authorities, and the peasants had a much greater sense of communal solidarity than the Bolsheviks gave them credit for, and many were reluctant to turn on each other. This idea of kulaks was, some argue, a bit misleading. The kulaks were peasants, and so the sense of communal solidarity between them was not as weak as Lenin believed, or Lenin wanted to believe. As historian Lars Lee said, instead of splitting the village, the kombedi united it in rage and fury against the Bolsheviks. By December 1918, so this lasted about 6 months, the committees of the poor were abandoned. What took its place? Well, first of all, in May 1918, so earlier still, the Sovnarkom issued the Decree on Food Procurement, in which all surplus grain grown by peasants was to be requisitioned by force, initially by the committees of the poor, and then later by grain requisitioning squads. Peasants resisted grain requisitioning by hiding grain, and also through armed resistance. So they murdered 15,000 requisitioning agents between 1918 to 1920. Lenin wrote to the officials in charge of securing food for the cities, quote, and he is quoted as saying, "For God's sake, use the most energetic and revolutionary measures to send grain, and more grain." As he had said before, bread, the access to bread was the key to the revolution at this point. And this reminds us of the February Revolution, when bread shortages due to World War I was a leading contributor to workers standing up against the Tsarist regime. From January 1919, Cheka agents and armed workers were formed into requisitioning squads to requisition grain from peasants, and then sent to the countryside to seize hoarded surplus from villages. These requisitioning squads usually took all the grain they could find, leaving no seeds for peasants to plant. Now, that is a terrible mistake. Yes, they needed bread in the cities. There were food shortages all over Russia, but to leave no seeds means that no more grain can be grown, or not enough grain can be grown to continue that cycle of growth and harvest. So this, I'm sure you can imagine, led to even greater food shortages and a famine in 1921. The cycle of increasing violence between Bolsheviks and peasants led to 50 large peasant rebellions in 1921, as well as the Tambov uprising in 1920. Between 1917 and 1921, the amount of land under cultivation dropped by 40% due to these seeds being taken by the requisitioning squads, and harvests were down about 37%. So you can see where this is going, and we will touch on the 1921 famine in our next video. So that sort of brings us to the end of the key policies of war communism. Here is a graphic organizer from your textbook, Reinventing Russia by Tom Ryan, that shows some of the key aspects of war communism. So we've got the nationalization of industry. The decree on nationalization really launched the policies of war communism. It was the first step in these policies. The militarization of workplaces included labor armies, harsher workplace conditions, and subotnik, voluntary weekend work. The elimination of the monetary economy due to hyperinflation led to a booming black market, with bagmen traveling the countryside, leaving the cities to trade goods for food. State-supplied services included the rationing system, food rationing system, public transport, public housing, were all supplied by the state. And grain requisitioning was the key agricultural aspect of war communism. So starting with the Kombedi, Committees of the Poor, which was largely unsuccessful. So that led to Prodrazvestka, which was the forced grain requisitioning. And this image really shows what that was all about. So the requisitioning squads forcefully taking grain from the peasants. So by the end of, by early 1921, after the Civil War was already over, but these policies continued, we had huge strikes and riots, and there was mass discontent by both workers due to the militarization of the workplace and by peasants due to grain requisitioning and food shortages. So here are some historical interpretations of war communism. There is a large amount of historical debate over war communism. So some historians argue that although the policies of war communism were severe, they were necessary because of the Civil War and because of the economic collapse. While others believe that the policies merely demonstrated Bolshevik ideological fanaticism rather than a response to circumstances. So on the one hand, we've got Sheila Fitzpatrick and Stephen Smith. Sheila Fitzpatrick says that to cope with a desperate situation, they turned to more radical policies. So that's saying that this was all due to circumstances. And Stephen Smith says the Bolsheviks had no choice but to take from the hungry to give to the hungrier. So again, a response to the severe circumstances that they were faced by. Richard Pipes, on the other hand, he despises the Bolsheviks, and he says that such rank amateurs would turn upside down the economy of tens of millions, subjecting it to innovations never attempted anywhere, says something of their judgment. So Pipes is, you can almost guarantee that Pipes is going to have a quote that is against the Bolsheviks, and there is just one example. I've got another example here from the study guide. Richard Pipes says that war communism was not a response to the Civil War, but an attempt as rapidly as possible to construct a communist society. So Sheila Fitzpatrick, Stephen Smith saying this was a response to the Civil War, a response to these circumstances. Richard Pipe saying that that's just a convenient. That's just convenient. Really, it was not a response to the Civil War. It was just a push to move towards communism. So that brings us to the end of this video on the policies of war communism. I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.